On a Tuesday morning in late October of 2019, every cattle farmer in Marshall County, Kansas, was doing the same thing. They were standing at the back of their pickups, looking at hay prices on their phones, and doing math. That didn't work out. The drought had come in June and hadn't left. The grass was gone. The hay was expensive. And the cattle were hungry. Every farmer in the county was making the same calculation. How much can I sell? How much can I afford to feed? And how much am I going to lose before this is over? It was the kind of crisis that arrives quietly, builds slowly, and then, one morning, you're standing in a dead pasture with a phone in your hand, and the numbers just don't add up. Every farmer except one. Let me tell you about Linnea Gustafson, because she's the reason this story exists, and she's different from every character this channel has told you about. Not different in the way people use that word to mean strange or difficult, different in the way that matters. She saw something everyone else had looked at for years and never noticed. And what she saw was a tree that most people in Marshall County would have cut down if they'd had the time and the chainsaw. Linnea was 22 years old in the spring of 2017 when this story really begins, though the roots of it go back further than that. She had grown up on her family's operation, 460 acres of mixed pasture and cropland in the northeastern corner of Marshall County, about 12 miles outside of Marysville. Her father, Gunnar Gustafson, had farmed that ground the same way his father had farmed it and the way his grandfather had farmed it before that. Cow-calf operation, roughly 80 head, commercial Angus crosses mostly, with some semental influence in the bigger cows. They ran the cattle on native grass pastures in the summer, fed hay and silage through the winter, sold the calves in the fall. It was a good operation. Gunnar was methodical and careful, and he knew his ground the way a man knows the back of his own hand. He wasn't a man who took chances. He wasn't a man who needed to. Linnea had gone to Kansas State University. She'd studied animal science with a minor in agronomy, which was not unusual for a farm kid from Marshall County. What was unusual was the elective she took in the spring of her sophomore year, a course in agroforestry taught by a professor named Dr. Clarence Mbeki, a Kenyan-born researcher who had spent 20 years studying how trees and livestock interacted in pasture systems across 3 continents. Dr. Mbeki was not a popular professor. The university offered it every other year and had discussed cutting it from the catalog twice. Linnea took it because the time slot fit her schedule, and because the course description mentioned cattle, and cattle were the only thing she was really interested in. She walked out of that course with something she hadn't walked in with, a question she couldn't stop asking. The question was this: why does every pasture in Marshall County look exactly the same? Let me tell you about what she learned in that course, because you need to understand the science before you can understand what she did with it. Dr. Mbeki had spent years documenting the interaction between certain tree species and grazing livestock in silvopasture systems. That's the formal name for intentionally integrating trees into pasture land. Not shade trees in the corner. Trees distributed through the pasture itself, managed alongside the cattle, producing something the cattle could eat. And the tree that kept appearing in his research on the Great Plains was one that most farmers in Kansas would have recognized immediately and dismissed just as quickly: the honey locust, Cladicea triacanthos. A scrubby, thorny, fast-growing native tree that most cattle producers in Marshall County considered a nuisance species, something that crept in along fence rows and creek bottoms, What Dr. Mbecky's research showed, and what he walked Linnea through over the course of 16 weeks, was that the honey locust was not a weed. It was a feed source. The seed pods that honey locust trees produce in late summer and fall contain between 30 and 37% sugar by dry weight, along with 12 to 15% crude protein, numbers that compare favorably to commercial cattle feed supplements. A mature honey locust tree in a good year can drop between 50 and 200 pounds of pods. Cattle will eat them directly off the ground. The pods are highly palatable. Cattle will seek them out and consume them preferentially over dry grass. And here was the part that stopped Linnea cold when she first read it. The pods drop in late summer and fall, exactly when native grass quality declines and producers begin supplementing feed. The tree produces its feed at the moment the pasture stops producing enough of its own. Dr. Becky had documented operations in Missouri and Illinois where managed honey locust populations in pastures had reduced purchased feed costs by 20 to 40% in normal years. In drought years, the numbers were harder to calculate, precisely because the drought affected the trees differently than it affected the grass. Honey locust is deeply taprooted, reaching water at depths that shallow-rooted grasses cannot access. Linnea wrote all of this down in a green spiral notebook that she carried everywhere for the rest of that semester. She filled 43 pages with notes, sketches of pod structure, yield estimates from Dr. Bader, Becky's field trials in Missouri, and calculations she ran herself based on her father's herd size and the acreage of their pastures. By the time she drove home for the summer after her sophomore year, she had a proposal that she had revised 4 times and was ready to present to her father. She presented it at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in late May of 2016, after supper when Gunnar was still sitting with his coffee. Her mother, Britta, was washing dishes at the sink and did not turn around but did not leave the room either, which Linnea had learned over the years was her mother's way of paying close attention. Linnea laid out the notebook and walked her father through it. The science, the pod yield numbers, Dr. Mbecky's field trials, the feed cost calculations she'd run for their specific operation, the timing, how the pods dropped precisely when they needed supplemental feed. She talked for about 20 minutes. Gunnar listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he picked up the notebook and looked at the pages she'd been referencing, turning them slowly, reading the numbers. Then he set it down and picked up his coffee cup and found it empty. He said, "I need to think about it." The kitchen went quiet. Britta stopped running water. Linnea waited. Gunnar said, "Those trees are thorny. They're hard on the cattle's mouths, and they spread if you let them." Linnea said she knew that, and that Dr. Maggie's research addressed both. The thornless cultivar Gladitia triacanthos inermis had been commercially available for decades and produced pods equivalent to the native thorny variety, and managed spacing prevented the spreading problem by controlling which trees were allowed to mature. Gunnar looked at the notebook again. He said, "I'll think about it." After Linnea had gone upstairs, Britta dried her hands on the dish towel and said to Gunnar, "She's right. You know." But he didn't say she was wrong either. Let me tell you about the spring of 2017, because that's when the story really starts to move. Linnea had come back from her junior year with a revised proposal and a contact a nursery in eastern Kansas that propagated thornless honey locust trees specifically for silvopasture applications. She had pricing. She had a planting density recommendation from Dr. Mbeki, who had agreed to correspond with her by email throughout the project. She had a 10-year projection of pod yield increases as the trees matured, and a conservative estimate of feed cost reduction that assumed only half the productivity Dr. Mbeki's Missouri trials had documented. Gunnar gave her the south pasture, 40 acres, he said. Plant your trees on the south pasture, and we'll see what happens. He said it in a way that communicated clearly that he was not expecting much to happen, but that he was willing to let her find that out for herself. He was not unkind about it. He was simply a man who had farmed the same way for 30 years and had good reasons for everything he did, and did not see a compelling reason to change. Linnea ordered 60 thornless honey locust trees that spring. She planted them herself over 3 weekends in April, spacing them at 40-foot intervals across the south pasture in a pattern she had designed to maximize pod drop coverage. She fenced each tree individually with a small wire cage to protect it from the cattle until it was established. She marked each tree with a numbered stake and began keeping records in a new notebook, a red one this time tracking growth rate, canopy spread, and eventually pod production as the trees matured. First person in Marshall County to hear about what Linnea was doing outside of the family was Dale Crowley. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand what he said and why it landed the way it did. Dale was 61 years old and had been the manager of the Marshall County Farm Bureau Cooperative for 19 years. Before that, he'd worked at the John Deere dealership in Marysville for 8 years, and before that, he'd farmed himself 320 acres that he'd eventually sold when the operation couldn't support his family, and a land payment at the same time. Dale knew farming. He knew Marshall County farming specifically, the soil types, the rainfall patterns, the cattle operations, the crop ground, the economics of all of it. He was not a stupid man, and he was not a cruel man. But he was a man who had spent 20 years being the person other people came to for answers, and that had given him a certainty about what was right and what was wrong in Marshall County agriculture that was by 2017. Dale held court at the co-op counter most mornings from 7 to 9, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup and talking with whoever came in. He knew everyone. He knew their operations, their finances in a general way, their family histories. He was the informal authority on what was sensible and what was not. Linnea came into the co-op in early June of 2017 to pick up a mineral supplement order for her father. She was 21 years old, wearing a Kansas State jacket and carrying the red notebook. Dale was at the counter with 3 other men, Hank Sievert, who ran a feedlot operation north of Marysville, and 2 brothers named Ernie and Chester Hodges, who farmed row crops east of Waterville. Linnea knew all of them. They knew her as Gunnar's daughter, which in Marshall County meant they knew her as a child, regardless of the fact that she had a year of college left and 40 acres of silvopasture in the ground. Dale asked her what she was up to, and she made the mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake at all, but a deliberate choice of telling him honestly. She described the honey locust planting on the south pasture. She mentioned the pod yield research. She said she thought it could meaningfully reduce their feed costs in drought years specifically. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside the range of things he considers possible that his first response is amusement rather than argument. Hank Sievert smiled. The Hodges brothers exchanged a look. Dale said, Linnea, honey locusts are a fence row weed. Your daddy's been fighting those things along his creek bottom for 30 years. You're going to plant them on purpose? She said yes, the thornless cultivar managed spacing, and the pod production data from Missouri showed Dale held up his hand. He said, I've seen a lot of young people come back from college with ideas about how to fix farming. He said it not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the subject. He said, your daddy's a good farmer. You stick with what he knows, and you'll be all right. Then he turned back to Hank Sievert and resumed a conversation about futures prices that Linnea's presence had interrupted. Linnea picked up the mineral supplement, loaded it in the truck. She did not mention the conversation to her father. She did not mention it to her mother. She opened the red notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page and kept going. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone laughed at an idea before they finished hearing it? Not because the idea was bad, but because the idea came from someone they had already decided didn't have good ideas. Dale Crowley was not protecting Marshall County farmers from a bad idea. He was protecting himself from the discomfort of taking seriously something that came from a 21-year-old woman in a college jacket. The laugh was not about honey locusts, it was about who was proposing them. And that distinction matters, because it tells you everything about why the next 2 years unfolded the way they did. Let me tell you about what happened over the following seasons, because the proof didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated the way water fills a bucket, slowly, steadily. The 60 trees Linnea planted in the spring of 2017 were too young to produce significant pod yields that first fall. She knew this going in, Doctor. Becky had told her that meaningful production would begin in year 2 and increase substantially through years 3 and 5, as the canopy spread. What she did in the fall of 2017 was establish her baseline. She weighed the pods from each numbered tree, recorded them in the red notebook, and calculated her total yield for the south pasture. 41 pounds of pods from the most productive trees, nothing from the youngest. Total feed value, calculated against the price of commercial supplement that fall, $38. It was not impressive. She wrote it down anyway. She also recorded something else that fall. She had released the cattle into the south pasture in late September, and she watched them. Within 2 hours of entering the pasture, the cattle had located every tree that had dropped pods and were working the ground beneath them with a focused attention that she had never seen them give to any other part of the pasture. They cleaned the ground under each tree completely before moving on. She wrote that down too. The fall of 2018 was different. The trees were in their second year of growth, and the thornless honey locust is a fast grower. In good conditions, it can add 4 to 6 feet of height per year. The 60 trees on the south pasture had grown substantially, and the pod production reflected it. Linnea weighed and recorded yields from each tree. Total pod production that fall. She calculated the feed value at the current price of commercial supplement, $640, against the cost of the 60 trees, the fencing materials, and her labor. She was not yet in the black on the investment. But she was close, and the trees would keep growing. She brought the numbers to the kitchen table that November. Gunnar looked at them for a long time. He said, 800 pounds off 40 acres. She said yes, and that it would double again by year 3, based on Dr. Mbiki's yield curves. Gunnar looked at the notebook. He said, the Cattle found them on their own, she said, within 2 hours. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing something away, rather than responding to it. He did not say much else. But 2 weeks later, without Linnea asking, he said, 60 more acres. She ordered 80 more trees in the spring of 2019. Let me tell you about what was happening in the rest of Marshall County during this same period, because context is everything. The years 2017 and 2018 had been reasonable years for rainfall in northeastern Kansas. Not exceptional, but adequate. Cattle operations in the county were running normally. Nobody was thinking much about feed costs because the grass was growing and the hay was coming in at normal prices, and there was no particular reason to think about alternatives. Dale Crowley was at the co-op counter every morning talking about futures, prices and equipment, financing, and the usual business of a county agricultural economy that was functioning as it always had. A few people had noticed what Linnea was doing on the Gustafson place. You can't plant 60 trees in a pasture in a county where everyone knows everyone's business without people noticing. The reaction was mostly what you'd expect. Some people thought it was an interesting experiment. Most people thought it was a young person's project that would quietly fade. Hank Sievert drove past the south pasture one afternoon in the summer of 2018 and told Dale at the co-op the next morning that Gunner's daughter had turned the south pasture into something that looked like a park. Dale said he hoped Gunner knew what he was getting into, letting a college kid replant his pastures. The Hodges brothers didn't say anything in particular. They were busy with their own ground and had no strong opinion about honey locusts one way or the other, which was the most common response in the county. Let me tell you about the summer of 2019 in Marshall County, because it was the kind of summer that tests everything. Your operation, your planning, your margins, and your willingness to have done things differently when you had the chance. The drought came in June. Not a gradual dry spell, but a hard, sustained heat that settled over northeastern Kansas like something with weight to it. The native grass pastures went dormant by the 3rd week of June, which was 6 weeks earlier than normal. By July, producers across the county were making decisions they hadn't expected to make until September, pulling cattle off pasture early, buying hay at prices that had jumped 40% from the prior year, culling cows they hadn't planned to cull, and doing all of it with the knowledge that the drought might not break until fall, or might not break at all. The math was brutal. Hay that had been selling for $90 a round bale in May was selling for $138 by August. A cow requires roughly 26 pounds of dry matter per day. An operation with 80 head burning through hay at drought year prices was looking at feed costs that could run $4,000 a month or more above their normal summer baseline. For operations that were already running on thin margins, and most cattle operations in Marshall County were running on thin margins, this was not a manageable number. It was the kind of number that meant selling cattle, taking losses, and hoping the following year was better. Gunnar Gustafson was doing the same math as everyone else. He had 83 head going into the summer of 2019, and by mid-July, his native grass pastures on the east and west sides of the operation were in the same condition as everyone else's. Short, dry. He was buying hay, he was watching the numbers, he was doing what he had always done, which was manage carefully and absorb what couldn't be avoided. But the south pasture and the north pasture were different. Let me tell you about what Linnea saw in the south pasture in late July of 2019, because it was the moment everything she had been working toward became visible all at once. The native grass in the south pasture was in the same condition as everywhere else, dormant, dry, nutritionally depleted. But the honey locust trees were not dormant. They were deep-rooted, pulling water from 12, 15, 18 feet down, and they were growing. The canopy on the oldest trees had spread to 20, 25 feet in diameter. Not mature yet. They would mature in September and October, but they were there, hanging in clusters from branches that were full and green in a county where almost nothing else was green. Linnea watched them gravitating toward the trees in the heat of the afternoon, standing in the shade of the canopy, grazing the sparse grass beneath the trees, and waiting. They were not hungry in the acute way that cattle get hungry. When there's nothing at all, they were managing, supplemented by the hay. Gunnar was buying, but they were managing better on the south and north pastures than they would have on the bare ground elsewhere. By mid-September, the pods were dropping, and what happened over the following 6 weeks was what Linnea had calculated in her notebook 3 years earlier, but had never seen at full scale. The trees on the south pasture, now in their 3rd year of growth, the most productive of the two groups, produced a total of 4,380 pounds of pods. The trees on the north pasture, 1 year younger, produced 2,160 pounds. Combined, 6,540 pounds of pods, dropping across 100 acres of pasture over a 6-week period in exactly the window when purchased feed costs were at their most punishing. Linnea calculated the feed value against the August price of commercial supplement. The number was $4,910. Nearly $5,000 of feed that came off trees that had cost her father less than $3,000 to plant 2 years earlier, in a drought year, when every other producer in Marshall County was spending money they hadn't budgeted to keep their cattle alive. She brought the numbers to the kitchen table in October. She laid the red notebook open to the page where she'd done the final calculation. Gunnar sat across from her and looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Britta sat down too, which she didn't always do. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside, which had finally started to carry some moisture in it, the drought breaking at last, the way droughts eventually do. Too late for the grass, but in time for the winter. Gunnar said, $4,910. Linnea said, yes. He said, off 100 acres of trees that we planted ourselves. She said, yes. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, and this was the most words Gunnar Gustafsson had ever said about this subject at one time. You were right. I should have listened to you in 2016. He paused. He said, all 460 acres. You tell me what you want to plant and where, and we'll plant it. Britta reached across the table and put her hand on Linnea's hand. She didn't say anything. But the story doesn't end at the kitchen table. Let me tell you about what happened in the county, because the private vindication was only part of it and the public part was still coming. The feed crisis of 2019 was not invisible. It was the main topic of conversation at the co-op, at the feed store, at the sale barn in Marysville, and at every kitchen table in Marshall County from July through November. People were comparing notes on hay prices, on how many head they'd had to sell, on what their feed bills had looked like. It was the kind of shared difficulty that rural communities absorb together. Not without pain, but with the particular solidarity of people who understand that everyone is facing the same weather. And in the middle of those conversations, a detail kept surfacing. People who had driven past the Gustafson place, the south pasture, the north pasture, had noticed that the cattle on those pastures looked different. Not dramatically different, not visibly fat in a way that would have been obvious at a distance, but carrying their condition better than cattle elsewhere in the county. A few people mentioned it to Gunnar at the sale barn. Gunnar said Linnea would know more about it than he did, and directed them to her, which was itself a notable thing for a man like Gunnar Gustafson to do. Dale Crowley heard about the Gustafson numbers in November. Linnea didn't know exactly how. Marshall County is a small place, and numbers like that travel, but she got a phone call from her father one afternoon saying that Dale had been asking about the south pasture at the co-op. A week later, on a cold Thursday morning in the first week of December, a truck pulled into the Gustafson driveway. Linnea was in the barn doing morning chores. She heard the truck and came out to find Dale Crowley standing in the yard, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the south pasture fence line where the tops of the honey locust trees were visible above the rise. He was 63 years old, and he looked it that morning. He had the look of a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable for a while, and has finally decided to put it down, even if putting it down is also uncomfortable in its own way. He said good morning. He looked at the pasture for another moment, and then he said, "I heard your numbers from this fall." She said, "Which numbers?" He said, "The pod yield, the feed value." She said, "Almost $5,000 off 100 acres. He was quiet. Then he said, "I'd like to understand what you did if you're willing to walk me through it." Linnea looked at him for a moment. She thought about the co-op counter in June of 2017. She thought about the laugh, and about Hank Sievert's smile, and about Dale's hand going up before she'd finished her sentence. She thought about the 43 pages in the green notebook and the 3 years of red notebook entries and the 4,380 pounds of pods on the south pasture in September. She said, "You told me my daddy was a good farmer, and I should stick with what he knows." Dale said, "I know what I said." She said, "The lesson isn't that honey locusts are better than hay. The lesson is that any operation running on a single feed source needs only one bad summer to be in trouble. We've known that about crops for 100 years. We act like it doesn't apply to pasture systems." Dale didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Will you show me the pasture?" She showed him the pasture. She walked in through the south 40 acres in the December cold, showing him the trees, explaining the spacing, the pod production mechanics, the root depth that made the trees drought-resistant in a way the grass was not. She showed him the red notebook, not all of it, but the yield pages and the feed value calculations. He asked questions. They were good questions. She answered them. When they got back to the driveway, Dale stood by his truck for a moment. He said, "I've got 6 producers who are going to be in serious trouble if next summer is anything like this one was." He said, "I'd like to bring them out here if you'd be willing." She said, "I'm willing." He said, "I'll be honest with you. I didn't think you knew what you were talking about in 2017. She said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong." She said, "Yes." He got in his truck and drove away. Linnea stood in the driveway for a moment in the cold, watching the truck go down the county road. Then she went back into the barn and finished her chores. Let me tell you about the 2 years that followed, because the story doesn't stop with Dale Crowley's visit. It expands, the way a good idea expands when the right conditions finally exist for it. Dale brought 6 producers out to the Gustafson place in January of 2020. Linnea walked them through everything: the science, the planting, the management, the numbers. She had prepared a written summary, 8 pages, with the yield data from both pastures and a cost-benefit analysis that any cattle producer in Marshall County could apply to their own operation. Mabeke on a phone call to answer technical questions, and she held the phone up in the south pasture while he walked through the root depth research with 6 Kansas cattle producers who had never heard of silvopasture and were listening with the particular attention of people who have recently lost money and are motivated to not lose it again. 3 of the 6 producers planted honey locust trees that spring, not on the scale Linnea had. Smaller trials, 20 to 40 trees each. Cautious starts from men who had been cautious their whole lives and had good reasons for it. But they planted, they kept records, they asked Linnea questions through the growing season, and she answered them, and she drove out to look at their trees when they were uncertain about something. By the fall of 2020, with a second drought year in 2 of the 3 counties to the west, the conversation at the co-op had shifted. Not completely. Marshall County does not shift completely on anything quickly, but noticeably. Dale had stopped saying what he'd said in 2017. He had started saying something different, which was that there might be something to this silvopasture approach, and that people ought to look at what the Gustafsons were doing. By 2021, 11 producers in Marshall County had honey locust trees in their pastures. By 2022, it was 19. Linnea was fielding calls from producers in Washington County to the north and in Republic County to the west. Meki had connected her with the Kansas State Extension Service, and she had given a presentation at the Extension office in Marysville in March of 2022 to an audience of 34 farmers, which was more people than the Extension office had seen for a voluntary educational program in several years. She stood at the front of the room with a laptop and a printed version of her red notebook data and walked through everything she had done and everything she had learned. Gunner was in the back row. He had not told her he was coming. She saw him when she was about halfway through the presentation, sitting in a folding chair at the back of the room, with his hat in his lap, watching her. He did not smile when she caught his eye. But he nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod that meant he was filing something away. And when she finished, and the room applauded, he stood up. He was the only person in the room who stood. He sat back down quickly, as if he hadn't meant to, but he had stood. Let me tell you about the Gustafson operation today, because the numbers tell the rest of the story better than anything else can. Linnea manages all 460 acres now. She has expanded the honey locust planting to 220 acres of pasture ground, not every acre, because silvopasture is not a replacement for grass management, but a complement to it, and she knows the difference. The trees on the south pasture are 6 years old now. In a good year, they produce enough pods to reduce the operation's purchased feed costs by 31%. In a drought year, and there have been drought years, the reduction is closer to 44%. Because the trees produce when the grass does not. The operation runs 97 head now, up from 83 in 2019. The cattle are commercial Angus crosses with some Simmental influence, the same as they always were. They are, by every metric Linnea tracks: average daily gain, body condition score at weaning, conception rates, performing at or above the county average on an operation that is spending significantly less on purchased feed. The red notebook has been replaced by a spreadsheet, but Linnea still keeps the notebook. It's on the shelf above her desk in the farm office, next to the green one from Dr. Mbieki's class. She keeps them there, not for sentiment, exactly, though there is some of that, but because she has found that people who come to the farm to see what she's doing, and people come regularly, now respond differently when they see a handwritten notebook than when they see a spreadsheet. The notebook makes it real in a way that a screen doesn't. It makes it look like what it was. A person paying attention over a long period of time and writing down what they saw. Dale Crowley retired from the co-op in 2021. At his retirement gathering at the co-op, which Linnea attended, he said in his remarks that the best thing that had happened in his 19 years at the Marshall County Farm Bureau was watching a young woman prove him wrong about something he'd been certain about for decades. He said it directly and without qualification, which surprised people who knew him, and which Linnea received without comment, which surprised people who knew her. Afterward, in the parking lot, Dale shook her hand and said, "I'm sorry it took me as long as it did." She said, "The trees took time too." He laughed. It was a different laugh than the one in 2017. Hank Sievert planted 60 honey locust trees on his north pasture in the spring of 2022. He called Linnea to ask about spacing. She told him what she knew. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more chapter, and it belongs to the next generation. In the spring of 2023, Linnea's younger brother, Erickson, Eric everyone called him, 18 years old and freshly back from his first year at Kansas State, came to the kitchen table after supper with a notebook of his own. He sat down across from Linnea and laid it open and said he'd been reading about managed rotational grazing with integrated poultry, laying hens following the cattle through the pasture rotation, breaking parasite cycles in the soil, adding fertility. He said he thought they could run 300 hens on the operation without significant infrastructure cost, and that the research from operations in Missouri and Iowa showed a measurable improvement in soil health metrics within 2 years. He talked for about 20 minutes. Linnea listened without interrupting. When he finished, she picked up the blue notebook and looked at the pages he'd been referencing, turning them slowly, reading the numbers. She set it down. She said, "Yes, not I. Need to think about it. Not let me look at the research. Not you. Stick with what we know." She said yes, and she said it the way someone says yes when they have been on the other side of that answer, and know exactly what it costs to hear no. Eric looked at her for a moment, surprised by the speed of it. "We'll build the mobile co-ops this summer," she said. "Keep the notebook. Write everything down. Every yield, every cost, everything the cattle do differently when the hens are following them." He said, "You're not going to make me prove it first." She said, "I'm going to make you document it." That's different. The proof is in the documentation. He nodded. He closed the blue notebook. Then he opened it again and wrote something at the top of the first page. She didn't ask what it was. She found out later when she picked it up off the kitchen table where he'd left it. At the top of the first page in his handwriting, he had written, she said yes. Gunnar was sitting in the living room when this conversation happened. He could hear it from where he sat. But Britta, who was at the sink again, turned around this time. She looked at Linnea for a moment, then she smiled and turned back to the dishes. The south pasture is green in July now, when the rest of the county is going brown. The honey locust trees are tall enough that you can see them from the county road, a line of full canopy rising above the fence line, dark green against the pale summer sky. People slow down when they drive. A few of them have called the farm number, which is listed in the county directory, and asked to come see it. Linnea always says yes. She planted honey locusts in a wheat county. They laughed. The drought came, the grass died. The hay prices doubled, the pods dropped, and the Gustafson cattle were the only ones in Marshall County still gaining weight.